Hi, welcome to Rear Facing Toddlers. I went to Gothenburg in Sweden last week to attend a conference hosted by Axkid, and when I was there, I had the honour of meeting Tommy Pettersson, who is the man behind the Swedish Plus Test. Now, if you know anything about extended rear-facing car seats, you've probably heard of the Swedish Plus Test, but you may not exactly know what it is or where it came from. So Mr. Pettersson held a presentation explaining all about the Plus Test, and I took pictures of all the slides in that presentation, and at the end I went up to him to ask his permission to use them in this video, which he gave me permission for, but he did ask me not to use the final photograph. So when you get to the end of this slideshow, you will see that I've replaced the last picture with one of my own children when they were very little. So who is Tommy Pettersson? He is the senior advisor at the Swedish National Road and Transport Research Institute, also known as VTI. The V actually stands for väg, which is the Swedish word for road. And he specializes in crash safety. And he started by explaining what VTI's technical resources are. And they include a crash test track, tyre testing facilities, laboratories for material testing, a road simulator, a driving simulator, road surface monitoring, and models for traffic simulation, vehicle costs, energy use, and exhaust emissions. And then he goes on to explain a little bit about himself. And he basically says he is an elderly gentleman. He's been semi-retired since 2020, but actually started work at VTI in 1984, and he attended his first child seat test nearly 40 years ago. He was the manager at the VTI crash test facility from 2004 till 2020, and a member since the start of the TSG in 1995. Now, he did say what the TSG is, and I didn't write it down, but if I remember it correctly, I think it stood for Transport Service Group, I think. He has also represented Sweden in the UN ECE R129 regulation, and his current project is that he is responsible for the physical dummies SET 50F and 50M, and his nickname is Mr. Rear Facing. Before explaining what the Swedish Plus Test actually is, he takes us right back to the beginning of rear-facing car seats, back to the 60s. And the whole journey started then, and the idea behind rear-facing was actually the space program. The idea came from astronauts because they lie down during takeoff, which supports their back and their head. And a professor called Bertil Oldman from Chalmers University in Gothenburg transferred this into rearward-facing CRS. You'll hear the phrase CRS a bit more throughout this video, and it actually stands for Child Restraint System, what we know as a car seat. Now, VTI and Bertil Oldman started a research collaboration. Child safety now celebrates its anniversary with 60 years of rearward facing, and the first rear-facing child seat prototype was crash tested in 1964 in a Volvo PV444. During the 60s and the 70s, a lot of research was done on rearward and forward-facing child seats. A lot of dynamic tests were performed, and the researchers came together to discuss their thoughts, and the outcome was rearward-facing is superior. In 1975, the TSV, which is the former name of the Swedish Transport Administration, got together with VTI, which as we know is the Swedish National Road and Transport Research Institute, and they put the Swedish protocol/regulation for child seats into force. And they came up with the T approval. And the T approval was a crash test that measured the G-force in the head as well as the G-force in the chest. Now, of course, the chest and head are important, but also comparing the differences between the two. And that gives you an indication of the forces on the neck. Now, the T approval was a very clever test because they knew that rear-facing seats were much safer, so they gave the T approval very low limits, which meant that forward-facing seats would not be able to pass it. Now, in Sweden, where the car seat was basically invented in 1964, they always had rear-facing car seats. They just don't have a choice. They go to the shop to buy a car seat and they're all rear-facing. It's not possible to have a forward-facing child seat approved in Sweden. Because the whole story started with rearward-facing, that's considered normal in Sweden. They all use rear-facing car seats. Despite the fact that Sweden has had its T approval since 1975 for testing child car seats, there was actually no regulation in place in the rest of Europe until R44 was introduced in 1981. And because all European countries had to agree on the criteria for the R44 testing, and they were all quite reluctant to rear face despite the fact that Swedish experience had proved it to be much safer, they decided not to give R44 any limits for the head and neck. Now in Sweden, up until 2008, it was very common for car seats that were rear-facing only to have both approvals. So they were R44 and they also had the T approval. And this was just something that they did in Sweden despite the fact that no other European countries followed suit. But then in 2008, they were no longer allowed to do that. And this is actually a little video that I made of the conference presentation where Mr. Pettersson explains what happened himself.
Not so very common for Sweden. We did like this. We don't hear anything, we have not understand anything. We haven't heard. So we just continue with it. Up to 2008. And by that time I had a telephone call from the road administration. And they say, "Hello Tommy, hello. We have a news to present for you." Okay, so what's up? There's a rumble in the jungle down there in the European Union. What? We have to take away the T approval, otherwise we might end up in court. Became a member of the European Union and I'm pro. I like the European Union, but by becoming a member, sinking down the level of safety for our children? No, it shouldn't be like that. And then the Plus Test idea came up in my mind. And what is Plus Test?
So because Sweden were no longer allowed to use their T approval test because of limitations that the European Parliament put upon them, Tommy Pettersson and VTI decided to come up with the Swedish Plus Test. And the Swedish Plus Test is voluntary. So that means it's not bound by any European laws. It's got nothing to do with R44 or R129. It's its own independent test that car seat manufacturers can apply for voluntarily. The Swedish Plus Test is basically a modern version of the previous T approval. It is done at a higher speed of 56.5 kilometers per hour, which is 35 miles per hour. It has a higher grade of deceleration, which means a shorter stopping distance, and it measures the neck forces, which the European Union regulations R44 and R129 don't do. The T approval crash test was always conducted with the P series of crash test dummies, the same ones that R44 uses. And in 2009, the new Q series of dummies was already available. But because they weren't being used yet for any regulation, VTI decided to use P series dummies for the new Swedish Plus Test, but to add neck sensors to those dummies. These are the limits for neck force in the Plus Test from 2009. For seats up to 18 kilos, it's 1,220 Newton, and for seats up to 25 kilos, it's 1,640 Newton. And the neck force basically measures how much the neck stretches in a crash. And this is the approval label, which grants seats a high level of safety for a child's neck. Then in 2013, the European Union introduced a new car seat regulation to eventually replace R44. And under the new R129 regulation, car seats have to meet a few different criteria. One of those is rear facing for a minimum of 15 months. Another one is a compulsory side impact test. And also, these tests now use the new series of dummies known as mannequins, the Q series. But still, they have no limits for the neck force. So VTI had to come up with a revised version of the Swedish Plus Test to match the new regulations and to be able to use the newer Q series of dummies. The new Swedish Plus Test is now done on the same test bench as the R129 testing in Europe. And as well as measuring the tension on the neck, it also measures the compression, so how much it stretches and how much it gets pushed down. And because R129 car seats are now classified by height rather than weight, they now had to do a test that matches those measurements. So for a child seat up to 105 centimeters, the limits are now 1,460 Newton. And for seats up to 125 centimeters, it's now 1,880 Newton. And in the Plus Test protocol, it says that only rear-facing car seats are able to pass this test. And because under R129, car seats are now classified by height rather than weight, the Swedish Plus Test has had to update its labels. So where the old stickers used to say the seats either went up to 18 or 25 kilos, they now say they either go up to 105 or 125 centimeters. So, is it true? Is it true that rear facing is better? Yes. How can we know that? By looking at the outcome of the tests. And this is again a little video clip that I recorded when I was there. So Mr. Pettersson will explain what happens in a crash test and show the differences between a forward-facing child seat and a rear-facing child seat.
But the good thing with the test is, if you look at the shell to the right, that shell is exactly the same shell that I'm using to the left. The only difference is the base. This CRS can be used rearward facing and forward facing depending on what base. So it's basically the same CRS. It's the same dummy. It's the same speed. And this is just 50 kilometers per hour. Let's hope for the best for the techniques and see if it works the first one. Look at the neck. And this is a collision in 50 kilometers per hour. Whoa! And hope for the best that the next film will start. It's just got one unit, like for the astronauts. The back, the spine, the neck, the head, just doing like this. And you can see in the end of the test, when all the energy is gone, I mean the crash is over, the dummy is slightly bending out and it says, "Thank you for a nice ride."
So why? Why all the research? Why do we have to have regulations? Why do we have the Plus Test? Why all the engagement from VTI? And why all these discussions? And the answer, very simply, is because. Please do not ever forget. So that was my slideshow presentation of Tommy Pettersson's actual presentation at last week's conference in Gothenburg in Sweden. I hope you found it as interesting as I did. And before I go, I would just like to thank Tommy Pettersson for all the amazing work that he has done over the years, for sharing his knowledge with us at the conference, and for allowing me to share that knowledge with you. Thank you very much for watching. Please like and comment and subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you very soon.